There is a precise 5-minute threshold where human consciousness completely alters its perception of reality. It is a strictly psychological window that early historical mystics deliberately targeted to bypass mental resistance and reach a state of non-dual awareness they called the monad. For centuries, this profound understanding of the human mind was completely obscured, deliberately replaced by lengthy dogmas, complex theological hierarchies, and highly structured institutional practices. But a careful examination of historical texts and modern neuroscience suggests that the original philosophical frameworks were never about spending entire lifetimes in isolated meditation, nor were they about pleading with a distant cosmic entity. They were about understanding the exact, measurable, and highly predictable mechanics of human attention. Here is what I mean by the monad and this critical 5-minute biological threshold. When we talk about the monad in a historical, philosophical, and psychological context, we are not talking about a distant deity residing in the clouds, nor are we discussing a supernatural invocation or a mystical spell. The monad, a concept deeply rooted in early Gnostic philosophy, Pythagorean thought, and Neoplatonism, refers to the absolute singularity. It is the undivided, fundamental consciousness from which all subjective human experience emerges. It is the state of pure, untethered awareness before the human mind instinctively splits reality into a dualistic, fragmented framework of me versus everything else. The 5-minute threshold is the biological, cognitive, and neurological timeline required to transition from our everyday, scattered state of mind into this unified field of perception. Modern neuroscience observes that when a human being consciously redirects their attention away from external environmental stimuli and internal narrative loops, it takes approximately 5 minutes for the brain's default mode network to begin actively powering down. To understand why this takes 5 minutes, we must understand the machinery of the brain. The default mode network is the neurological system directly responsible for generating our ego, our temporal anxieties, our constant daydreaming, and our rigid sense of a separate, isolated identity. Evolutionarily, this network was designed to keep us safe by constantly scanning the past for mistakes and projecting them into the future as potential threats. You cannot force this survival network to shut off instantly. If you try to aggressively suppress your thoughts, the brain registers the attempt as a psychological threat and creates immediate, intense cognitive friction. But if a specific structural focus is held steadily for exactly 5 minutes, the mind exhausts its habitual resistance. It burns through its immediate supply of anxious energy and inevitably settles. The early philosophers understood this biological cycle intimately, long before the invention of brain imaging. They knew that the human mind does not need to be violently conquered or suppressed. It simply needs to be outlasted through a highly specific, progressive sequencing of human attention. Why this profound shift happens is entirely a matter of sequential cognitive decoupling. Let us deeply break down the mechanics of how this 5-minute window was traditionally structured into 5 distinct progressive phases to systematically dismantle the illusion of separation and bypass the brain's defense mechanisms. First, there is the mechanism of somatic anchoring. In the modern, hyperstimulated world, human consciousness is almost entirely localized in the prefrontal cortex. We exist almost exclusively in our abstract thoughts, our digital projections, our anxieties about the future, and our constant obsessive rumination on past events. We are, psychologically speaking, entirely disconnected from the physical vessel. To initiate the shift toward the monadic state, the first mechanism requires anchoring awareness deeply and forcefully back into the physical body, specifically through the perception of the heartbeat. By placing attention entirely on the physical sensation of the heart pumping blood, you are forcing the brain to process raw, real-time, analog sensory data instead of abstract psychological constructs. The mind will inevitably and aggressively rebel against this constraint. It will generate a massive barrage of intrusive thoughts, urgent reminders, and sudden physical discomforts, trying to pull awareness back into the familiar territory of problem-solving and neurosis. This is simply the mind's self-preservation mechanism at work. The ego, terrified of losing its position as the center of your universe. The psychological framework here requires that you never fight the thoughts, but simply refuse them your primary attention. By continuously returning to the rhythm of the heartbeat for a full minute, a profound neurological anchor is built. You are literally engaging the vagus nerve, signaling to your central nervous system that the present physical moment is completely safe. This causes a vital downregulation of the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response. This somatic anchoring is the absolute mandatory foundation because the human brain is biologically incapable of accessing expanded states of awareness while its neurochemistry remains locked in a subtle, continuous state of survival mode. Second, we enter the phase of autonomic bridging. Once the heartbeat is stabilized, the wandering attention and the nervous system has signaled baseline safety, the cognitive focus expands to include the natural rhythm of respiration. The human breath holds a highly unique, almost paradoxical position in our biology. It is the only vital physiological system that functions completely autonomously, keeping us alive while we sleep. Yet, it can also be consciously controlled at will. Therefore, both psychologically and symbolically, the breath serves as the literal bridge between the unconscious and the conscious mind, between the dense material form and the formless awareness. By observing the breath without attempting to alter its depth, its rhythm, or its pace, a radical form of psychological non-interference is practiced. The consciousness is being explicitly trained to witness reality exactly as it unfolds, utterly stripping away the ego's constant obsessive need to manipulate, control, or optimize the environment. During this specific window, the friction between focused intent and the mind's desperate desire for distraction reaches its absolute peak. Feelings of intense impatience, profound doubt, or the frustrating sensation that absolutely nothing is happening will inevitably arise. These are not indicators of failure. They are the exact, predictable neurological symptoms of the default mode network actively losing its dominant tyrannical grip on your perception. As the dual anchor of heartbeat and breath is strictly maintained, the neural pathways associated with self-referential thought begin to experience a significant, measurable reduction in blood flow. The mind's frantic, scattered energy is slowly, methodically being starved of the attention it desperately needs to sustain its internal narratives. Third, the mechanism shifts into complete cognitive decoupling, often referred to historically as the phase of profound recognition. Up until this specific moment in the timeline, the internal practice has entirely been about stabilizing chaotic attention and pacifying the nervous system. Now, the mental mechanism shifts from passive biological observation to a fundamental, radical reframing of core identity. While holding the awareness of the physical anchors, a new cognitive realization is introduced into the psyche. The realization is precisely this: you are the awareness that is observing the physical sensations, not the physical sensations themselves. You are not the biological body that is breathing. You are the silent, eternal witness observing the breath. You are not the anxious, rapidly moving thoughts trying to distract you. You are the vast, empty, undisturbed space in which those thoughts briefly appear and quickly disappear. This is the precise moment of psychological decoupling. It is a profound, irreversible pivot where the center of identity shifts permanently from the transient contents of consciousness to the immortal container of consciousness itself. As this neurological recognition locks into place, a highly distinct phenomenological shift occurs. The rigid, heavy, defensive boundaries of the ego begin to become incredibly porous. The localized, tight sense of me starts to feel lighter, highly diffused, and entirely borderless. You are effectively stepping completely out of the relentless stream of linear time and psychological narrative and choosing to stand on the quiet, observing banks. This is exactly what early philosophical texts meant by the famous axiom, "Know thyself." It was never intended to mean understanding your superficial personality traits, your historical background, or your social preferences. It was an instruction to directly, intimately experience your fundamental nature as the unconditioned observer. This phase is where the initial mental friction entirely gives way to a profound, undeniable sense of internal, infinite spaciousness. Fourth is the mechanism of intentional receptivity. With the awareness now vastly expanded and successfully decoupled from the rigid ego structure, the consciousness is positioned directly at the precipice of the non-dual state. The mechanism required here involves establishing a psychological state of total, active surrender. It is an internal orientation of quiet, absolute declaration that the mind is finally ready to perceive what lies entirely beyond the constructed self. In traditional historical contexts, this was often framed as a direct invitation to the monad. However, it is absolutely vital to understand the modern psychology behind this language. This is not a petition to an external entity. You are not begging a distant universe for a mystical favor or waiting for a cosmic intervention. Instead, you are giving your own localized, restricted consciousness the ultimate permission it needs to collapse its artificial boundaries and merge seamlessly back into the universal field. You are consciously aligning your finite biological attention with the infinite awareness from which it originally sprang. In this state of highly tuned receptivity, neuroscientists observe that brainwaves typically shift outward from the rapid, anxious beta frequencies into deeper, slower alpha and early theta states. Neurological phenomena often manifest vividly here, such as a distinct bodily sense of physical expansion, subtle tingling across the central nervous system, or a deep, causeless peace settling entirely over the cognitive faculties. The most critical mechanism operating here is the absolute necessity to remain entirely non-grasping. If a profound, beautiful experience arises, it is simply observed without desperately clinging to it. If nothing dramatic happens at all, the quietness is observed without a single ounce of disappointment. True receptivity demands the absolute abandonment of expectation, simply because expectation is always just another covert, sophisticated operation of the ego trying to predict, control, and consume an outcome. Finally, the fifth mechanism is the state shift itself. This is the ultimate threshold of the exact 5-minute cognitive cycle. By this point in the neurological sequence, the initial somatic anchoring, the autonomic bridging, the cognitive decoupling, and the intentional receptivity have all deeply compounded upon one another. The psychological resistance of the brain has been systematically and entirely exhausted. The mechanism operating now is pure, unadulterated allowing. The consciousness simply rests inside the silent, vast architecture it has built over the previous 4 minutes. It is strictly within this final temporal window that the experiential shift into non-dual awareness, the monad state, typically and naturally occurs. The heavy, exhausting illusion of separation totally dissolves. The stark, painful distinction between the observer and the observed collapses completely into a single, unified field of being. Phenomenologically, individuals at this stage report a profound, unshakable realization that they are fundamentally, existentially safe. They realize with sudden clarity that their core essence is entirely untouched by the traumas, the social dramas, and the historical narratives of their physical existence. It is a direct, visceral, undeniable knowing of absolute unity. This is the biological and psychological completion of the threshold cycle. Less time, and the ego successfully maintains its defensive, fortified walls. More time, and the wandering mind often begins to fabricate new, complex illusions out of sheer boredom or a desperate desire for spiritual entertainment. The 5-minute window represents the precise, calculated, energetic cost required to permanently break the gravitational orbit of the conditioned human mind. The result of understanding and repeatedly experiencing this exact cognitive mechanism is a radical, permanent restructuring of how a human being processes everyday reality. The profound effects of crossing this threshold ripple far beyond the brief 5 minutes of the internal practice itself, creating measurable changes in both psychology and biology. First, there is a dramatic structural reduction in baseline anxiety, driven by actual neuroplasticity. When a person has directly experienced themselves as the underlying eternal awareness, rather than the fragile temporary ego, the daily dramas of material life instantly lose their absolute, terrifying grip on the nervous system. You begin to literally rewire the brain's response to stress. Situations that previously triggered intense panic, deep fear, or aggressive defensive anger are now perceived from a place of spacious, unshakable detachment. The amygdala becomes less reactive. You no longer automatically react from the accumulated trauma of the localized ego, but instead, you consciously respond from the profound clarity of the monad. Second, individuals begin to recognize a deep, undeniable, and almost mathematical coherence in their daily environment. Because the consciousness is now operating with significantly less cognitive friction and projecting far less localized fear into the world, the brain becomes highly attuned to patterns, synchronicities, and subtle opportunities that were previously completely obscured by the heavy, blinding static of mental noise. The environment literally seems to respond to this internal coherence. It is not supernatural magic. It is simply what naturally happens when the human operating system clears its deeply corrupted files, drops its defensive postures, and begins functioning at its intended, unfragmented frequency. The chaotic drama of material reality simply loses its power to manipulate your internal emotional state. A brilliant historical example of this exact mechanism in action and the absolute terror it generated among the ruling elite can be found in the reaction of orthodox institutions to the early Gnostic philosophical frameworks. When the Nag Hammadi library was discovered in the Egyptian desert in the mid-20th century, it revealed a treasure trove of early texts that heavily emphasized direct, personal, unfiltered experience of the divine over rigid institutional mediation. The radical, highly dangerous idea that any individual, regardless of their social status, wealth, or education, could entirely bypass the rigid hierarchy of priests and access the ultimate reality of the monad directly, simply by mastering their own attention and exhausting their ego's psychological resistance, was viewed as fundamentally and utterly disruptive. It deeply threatened the massive political and financial systems that relied entirely on positioning themselves as the sole, exclusive, and necessary mediators of ultimate truth. If all it took to access the absolute source of consciousness was a deep understanding of cognitive decoupling and a few minutes of perfectly structured, disciplined attention, then the massive, wealthy architectures of external authority were suddenly rendered completely obsolete. This is precisely why the quiet, internal mechanics of inner silence were forcefully and systematically replaced with loud, outer rituals. The profound, elegant simplicity of the psychological threshold was deliberately buried under centuries of incredibly complex dogma, fear-based theology, and endless rules. But the biological mechanics of the human brain have not changed a single bit in thousands of years. The exact same 5-minute threshold still exists exactly where it always has, waiting quietly beneath the chaotic, exhausting noise of modern cultural conditioning, completely accessible to absolutely anyone willing to objectively and courageously observe their own awareness. However, a strict boundary must be drawn regarding how this is approached. This mechanism only works if you approach the threshold completely devoid of the narcissistic desire to acquire spiritual trophies. In modern times, there is a dangerous trap often referred to as spiritual materialism, where the ego simply adopts the language of awakening to make itself feel superior to others. The monad state absolutely cannot be accessed by an ego that is desperately trying to become powerful, visibly enlightened, or detached in a way that fuels its own arrogance. It can only be realized when the ego is willingly, humbly, and entirely set aside. If you try to aggressively force this cognitive realization to happen, or if you approach the observation of your own mind with a rigid, impatient demand for specific cinematic visions or supernatural powers, you will simply remain completely trapped in a brand new, highly decorated layer of your own psychological reflections. The threshold does not respond to force. It only responds to truth. It requires an absolute, unconditional surrender of the human need to control the outcome. Let me know your thoughts on this fascinating intersection of historical philosophy and the modern mechanics of human consciousness in the comments below, and I will see you in the next deep dive.